Blog Talk Radio.
Good morning. This is your host, Llorraine Neithardt, and we are at Venus Unplugged, the virtual heartbreak hotel. What we do here is we explore all the aspects, archetypally, personally, transpersonally, in myth, in poetry, in literature, in life. All the different ways that psyche and love and eros operate. An ongoing quest for consciousness. Now, the thing about consciousness is always a loss to the ego. So you promise that you're going to be really loving to yourself, and the next thing you know, you're calling the person who envies you the most and making plans. It's like, oh dear. Because the ego says, no, let's just do it this way. We've always done it this way. People don't like to change. This is the way it's done. And but becoming conscious says, yeah, but my psyche, that's not my value system. This is what I value. So that's the rub in consciousness. And fairy tales, now this is just a thumbnail. I mean, you can spend at least the next 7 years reading and working and discovering the nature of fairy tales, and it's a worthy habit to pick up. The studying of how things work, because with each, these are tools for understanding your heart and your soul, other people, and also the nature of psyche and the nature of love. So this fairy tale code you can listen to last week's, which basically works with the difference between a myth. Now, a myth is our relationship, our archetypal relationship to the gods, to the archetypes. Man's relationship to the archetypal world of the gods. Fairy tale connects us to the pathology, the way that the collective unconscious not only views things, but the journey of individuation. Individuation is a Jungian term that means towards our wholeness. So when we read fairy tales, we begin to recognize, so I'm going to point out some things about fairy tales, which you probably feel or wonder about or never wondered about, which has you begin to grasp why the real purpose of fairy tales and what it brings to us. Yes, it is a delightful way to evoke and provoke images in the psyche. Yes, they are teachings, and they're moral teachings, and they're also meant to scare the shit out of kids so that they'll be good. But that doesn't always work. And all this journey towards love. There's so much in a fairy tale about relationships, and yet in some ways there's no human relationships. So let's proceed ahead here. For the last, do you believe it's 16 weeks, I was going over the story of Snow White. I still want to know who got the mirror after she had her evil stepmother burned to death and turned to ash, which is an interesting image, because in the ashes the phoenix rises again. So it's in fairy tales, it goes around and around and around. So when we finish a fairy tale, we need to ask, so what happens after the frog prince becomes king? Or, what happens after that? Or the supposedly happy ever after? Which just means there's been a moment of individuation. But happy ever after is not a permanent state. Otherwise, you'd be dead. There's just no, we have to have the tension of the opposites to be alive and to tell the story. So fairy tale code. So fairy tales are abstract in nature, quite extraordinary. And people will read them and just accept that the frog is really a prince, or, all these extraordinary things. It's complete abstraction. But so is the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is not personally involved. It's not invested. It's just the path. It's the road. So if you want to have a crash on the road, go have a crash on the road. It is eternal. It's like the flight of birds. They just know where they need to go, and so does the collective unconscious. So they have this kind of quality of like one-dimensional. It doesn't fill anything out, and there's in a sense there's no depth. We give the depth of feeling. We give that quality to it, depending on how the fairy tale, what it evokes inside of us. So let's say, for instance, you read a fairy tale and you're like, oh, I hate this fairy tale, okay? Guarantee you've got a complex. There's something in that fairy tale that the complex doesn't want you to see, doesn't want you to know about, or if it's just neutral. I mean, any extreme, take a second look at. Because the complex is saying, no, we don't want you to become conscious. Remember, consciousness is a loss to the ego. So fairy tales lack this kind of overall dimension of death. And the character of the tale, in this case Snow White, is without substance. She's without an inner life and without, in a sense, without an environment and without any relationship to time. So for those of that who are listening, she's 7 years old. I mean, she's born. First she's imagined in, almost like a genie. The queen, her mother, gives birth to her and she dies. The queen. And which is extraordinary. I mean, that would have you in therapy for the next 2,000 years. But in a fairy tale, it's like, oh, okay, next. It just keeps on going to the next thing, which exactly what's happening in the unconscious, in the collective unconscious. It just goes on. I mean, we may have a breakdown or hysterics or whatever, and it just waits till we start to catch on to what's really next. What do I need to do next? What is this about? And so, and she has, in a sense, no inner life. And then at 7, the father, who you only hear from once, marries this evil queen, and she brings her mirror, the truth-telling mirror. And when the envious, narcissistic queen, stepmother, finds out there's someone who could be more beautiful than she sends the huntsman to take her into the woods and kill her. Now, that's pretty extraordinary. But in the fairy tale, it's just what happens. And when there's no environment, it's like, and Snow White just leaves the castle. She doesn't take her a piece of bread. She doesn't take her dolls or dog, anything. Just leaves. You don't hear about her being freaked out that her life is on the line. So Snow White, or any hero or heroine in the fairy tales, they have no existential crisis. It's just they don't go there. This is just what they've got to do next, and that's how we understand and why fairy tales are understood, or what we work for, what we look like. What's going on here in the psyche that so we can start moving this in the right way, all right? And so, Snow White just gets on with the task. She leaves with the huntsman, and she just gets on with the task at hand. In fairy tales, the heroine is she's not tied to land or culture. It doesn't say, in a castle in Venusberg, okay, in Transylvania. We don't know any of that stuff. We just know it's a forest, which of course is a symbol for the unconscious. Doesn't say what kind of forest. Doesn't fill it in. That's what is the abstract and the one-dimensionality of it. Okay, and it certainly doesn't embellish. Fairy tales don't embellish. It's just the facts, the path. And they're not grounded, the fairy tales are not grounded in any historical, okay, come on, man, you could say this, in any contents in history. We don't know if it's BC, we don't know if it's 1794, where the story is being told. And they're also cross-cultural. So we find this past, the psychodynamics, cross-culturally. And they don't exist in any time that we know of. So we can see that as a parallel reality. And also lets us know that the collective unconscious isn't about time. It's got eternity. And it may take eternity to become conscious and to become whole. But we got to start somewhere, right? And objects in fairy tales kind of lack dimension. There are a few objects that are pretty consistent across the board in fairy tales, like mirrors and rifles and swords and rings. And these objects are rigid and unchanging. And then changes do occur, and when the changes do occur in a fairy tale, they're kind of very sudden and mechanical. The huntsman kills a deer and takes the liver to the queen and the queen eats it. She wants to eat the liver, and then we know symbolically the liver represents the seat of the soul, so she actually wants to eat Snow White's soul. Now, as that sounds, on another level, it's an image of transformation. If I can eat this, if I can get into this, I can become this. I can regain the beauty. And God knows all the twisted preparations that people, would make to retain beauty. So we've got a little bit of that going on there. But nobody goes like, oh my God, that's disgusting. It's like, no, cook up that liver and let's go for it. And human bodies lack dimension. I mean, in the Snow White story, we're told that it has to do with 3 colors, so we know those are the 3 colors of alchemy, but it doesn't describe Snow White other than that she's 7. Like I said, I find it very interesting when I went looking for images, because I'm going to be putting these podcasts up on YouTube. And when I went looking for images, right, of Snow White, it's like people think she's a dominatrix. She's dressed like a dominatrix. It's like, what are you thinking here? She's 7. And numbers are always a hint, a symbolic hint of what we're looking for. But in our current culture, she's made to look like a dominatrix, which is very sad. At any rate, so we don't know what they really look like. It's not tall, it's not short, it's not bony, it's not voluptuous. It's like whatever. Because the collective unconscious doesn't care about it. That's not its job of those details. Its job is to keep us on the path and to evoke change in us. But every object, every person, it has a very specific use and is usually used once when we're talking about objects. Now, in the Snow White, she uses the mirror 3 times. 3 once again. is a magical number of creation. So everything in a fairy tale, it's very concise. It really does mean something. So each time we reread a fairy tale, which is why we get another insight, same way each time we interpret a dream, we understand another aspect of ourselves. See, dreams are the stories of our own personal unconscious. Fairy tale is the collective, the world's soul and unconscious. So Snow White is about white, red, and black. That's what her mother wishes. In the story of Snow White, it's the good versus the evil mother. The birth mother, bio mom, dies, gives her life. Stepmother wants to take her life. I don't know about you, but that would freak me out. And yet in the fairy tales, it's just the way that it goes, which is fascinating. Because when we start to understand this and we start to see that this is a path, this is kind of, then we can calm down a little and go like, okay, so if this incident was a fairy tale, what is the collective unconscious screaming? What is it saying to me here? And we can start to see a cohesive story. Now, in fairy tales, when somebody's injured, blood doesn't flow. In the story of Snow White, there's 3 drops of blood. But there are other fairy stories like, the handless maiden. Her hands get cut off. It's like, what? No blood. Very neat. So is death. It's very neat. And then, severed limbs grow back magically. And mutilation and near-death experiences and being taken into the woods to have your liver cut out. It causes no trauma physically or psychologically. So that's how we know these are the building blocks. We fill that out. Our personal experience will fill that out, but not the fairy tale. Okay? And attitudes and sentiments are expressed in action. Snow White doesn't go like, but I deserve much better. It's like she gets on with it. She asks to be set free. She is set free, and then she's got to walk 7 mountains and through the forest and all that she has to do. She just gets on with the task. So, and there, in a sense, there's no psychological depth. She's not crying on the way. She's not texting about her story. She's not writing a book about her traumas. She's getting on with the job. And that's also what happens with us. We've got to get on. No matter what happens to us, we still have to get on with the journey of individuation, of becoming whole. Otherwise, we're just victim to all that's going on. Who knew? It's so exciting. It's like having an inner cosmos. It's being affected. And for those people that are involved with the science of astrology, they know they are affected by the pull and movements of the archetypal planets. Well, the same thing is going on internally. The collective unconscious has a world. So there are worlds within worlds. If we try to understand with our ego, the ego loses. That's the genius of fairy tales. They can give us great wisdom without threatening the ego. It's like, oh, and then we get an insight, hopefully. So Snow White doesn't mourn her fate. She simply gets on with it. Usually in fairy tales, people jump up and down and they get furious, like Rumpelstiltskin when he was tricked. But there's really basically no emotions that are expressed. Death or loss. No big thing. First queen dies, you don't hear the king lamenting. 7 years later, gets married again. New wife. That's it. Okay? And like when it's falling in love, in Snow White, when she's falling in love and getting married, and in some fairy tales, well, not Snow White. Yeah, I guess she does fall in love. She certainly falls out of that coffin. But when people are falling in love, when the hero or the heroine are falling in love or getting married, and then the next thing you know, they're lost, like in this, the birth and the death, and then Snow White is off, and there's separation from the parents or the partners or the king or the queen for years. The same thing happens in your unconscious, in your psyche. You can be in a journey for years. Because collective unconscious doesn't have a relationship to time as we understand it. And it has a lot of reversals. In fairy tales, we know Snow White endured extended suffering. In some fairy tales, you're silenced for 7 years. You can't talk, or you're in the forest. They never say which forest, what kind of forest. It's just a forest. So no internal emotions propel the character forward. Fairy tales are only about external events. It's like holy moly, my life's in danger. 3 times that wacko queen gets a costume on, shows up, and tricks Snow White. 3 times. And very often in a fairy tale, the warning will happen 3 times. What was happening 3 times with these temptations was poison. Deception and poison. Now, there's no eternal emotions. They're not freaking out. They just get along. They go with this. But when they struggle, in this case, we don't know how long Snow White is with the 7 dwarfs. And the 7 dwarfs, as I said before, they don't have names. Dwarfs don't have names in folk tales. But that one of the interpretations could be that's the 7 stages of alchemical transformation. And she's in there in this process of alchemy. After the 3rd temptation, when she bites into the apple, which is poisoned only on one side, hint, she falls into a deep sleep. This happens a lot in fairy tales. It's like a deep sleep. Hey, stay here and watch the cauldron, and they fall asleep. Like for a really long time. The task is to stay awake, but they fall asleep. Now, this is very necessary. It's necessary because it shows that Snow White is falling deep into the unconscious. She's in a process. You will not have an individuation process unless what they call the negredo, the blackening, the shadow. Your first encounter with individuation is an encounter with the shadow. Now, once again, shadow is whatever we don't know about ourselves. So we'll meet it in some twisted sister, or fall in love with the vilest of men, or marry Bluebeard, or all the various things that we do, which is all about individuation. The collective unconscious is not personally concerned with whether you're happy or not. Its job is to get you to wholeness. And if we can create a relationship and understand its job, we can cooperate. Instead of, I don't deserve this. It's not a matter of deserving or not deserving, or worthy or not worthy. It's your task, man. You know, you got to hold your role, man, and you can't, it's like the times we waste, hysterical, and life is unfair. Why? It's the process. It's showing us. And what's really interesting in fairy tales is nobody goes nuts. Nobody goes mad. Nobody goes insane. Nobody takes drugs. Nobody gets homesick. And they usually have no relation to their family of origin, which is also another hint, because we need to leave our family of, not necessarily literally, although sometimes that works the best, we need to leave our family of origin. That's the first betrayal we must perform. I'm not going to live my family's life. I'm going to live a life of my own values. Therefore, we're going to break somebody's heart. We have to say, we don't have to try to change people, but just go like, you know what, this isn't working. I have a different set of values, and I must. Not spending your whole life trying to figure out why your parents don't understand you. That's your protection. They understood you. They could keep you enslaved to their relationship to the collective unconscious, or worse, just being unconscious. Be thankful. That's your passport for getting out of Dodge. There are a lot of things that personally we feel, and that's in no way am I criticizing, because I know the pain of that. But when we catch on, like, whoa, I gotta leave. I've got to leave. Well, I mean, even Christ said to Mary, could you imagine? Hey, I'm not your son. I don't belong to you. I don't belong to the collective in this way. I got a different journey. And if you're fortunate enough to have wise siblings or parents, they go like, well, rock on, man, you're on your journey. Go. They also know that you're going to go through hell and back. But go you will. And this is why also, there's this quality of being chosen for an individuation task. And there's lots of tasks. I call it stuffing lentils, where you just stuff one lentil after another because it's so detail-oriented. Or Saturn can also tell us, where this fairy tale has taken us. But task we will have, along with keeping a job and having children and mowing the lawn and feeding the cats and all the things that we need to do. Okay? Oh, no. Okay. So no one has any age. Fairy tales contain critical information about the operations of psyche, and they're the purest example of the collective unconscious. And since, we're going to have to do Fairy Tale Code II, because there's a couple of interesting things that you really need to know. So go on my website, LorraineNeithardt.com, call for an appointment. And also, as I said, Snow White is going to be on YouTube. Yay, I did it. So have a blessed week. It's going to be pretty interesting. And just notice. Or write a fairy tale for yourself. Take an incident in your life and write a fairy tale. Remember, it doesn't have all the details and the emotions. Just write the structure. And I'll be talking to you next week. Bye-bye.
Progressive brings you Flowetry with Flo.
When Flo flows, she flows in the know. Mind ruminates the race. Shown them all, I heed the call. Seen the rest, I choose the best. Sometimes it's ours, sometimes it's not. When the fox walks, is it called a fox trot? That's a real question.
Compare Progressive direct rates with competitors' rates. Visit Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.